you, Marek.
Okay, so we're live for this how to access and use learning support funding for young people and adults session. I'd like to keep these sessions interactive as possible, so feel free to use the question or chat facility at any point throughout the duration of this webinar. Webinar is going to run for around about 2 hours, and we are going to split the session up, so there will be an opportunity for a comfort break there. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Bij Kacimarczyk. Thanks, Bij.
Thanks very much, Marek, and good morning to everyone. Hope everyone's keeping well. As Marek says, that we've got a 2-hour session here. There will be a break just after the hour. Usually, up to now on the other sessions, it's been after about an hour and 10 minutes. So we'll have a 10-minute comfort break, and then we'll go into the last session, which also includes some questions that we want you to consider during the course of the webinar, but also to take away. And those questions are for you and your team, whether you're in a college, a specialist college, an educational trust, a local authority, community learning background, or a school sixth form, whatever your context is. These are sort of 2 questions that we want you to consider, particularly if you've got a wide range of learners. What I mean by that is young people, 16, 17, 18-year-olds, as well as adults aged 19 and over, including those, of course, who are 19 up to 24 with education health care plans, and also for those of you who've got adults with adults aged over 24. So, and as Marek says, we want to keep the questions coming. So use the chat facility or the Q&A to pose questions, and we'll do our very best to answer in the course of the session. This is course 2. The first one's about high needs funding, and I know some of you have already attended that. This course is commissioned by the ETF and funded by the Department for Education. We're doing this in collaboration with NatSpec. So any questions that are posed today that I can't answer, then please contact Claire Howard. Her details are on the last set of slides before the break, or before the question, should I say, and at NatSpec, and she'll do her best to answer them. As I said, we've got a wide range of participants today. What also underpins the funding, learning support funding in England, our focus is for England, is the work that was done by Peter Little in the 2 reports that he produced with his consultants and advisors on the funding of learning support in the post-16 sectors, whether that be in a college, a school, training provider, a local authority, or a specialist provision, then it would be universal in its effect. The review of funding for those doing the work-based learning route was much more the work of Paul Maynard, who led a parliamentary working group to consider how best to support young people and adults who were undertaking apprenticeships and other forms of work-based learning. I think what you must also bear in mind that the review of funding for learning support was very much one of the focuses of moving forward the Ofsted report of 2016, which was looking at the relative success of implementing the Children and Families Act. And that legislative framework, of course, is critical in determining how to access learning support and how best to use it. And I think that's that start point. And by the way, you will get copies of the slides as well as the recording. Is to sort of say, well, can we just go back to basic principles? What do we mean by learning support? Or more accurately, what do we mean by additional learning support? And I think it's sometimes useful to go back to those first principles, which were espoused way back in the 90s after incorporation, were very much picked up, as I said, by the Little reports and by the Maynard working group, is to say that the word additional is critical. There's an assumption that any learner, whether it be a young person or adult, who is publicly funded in England by the Education and Skills Funding Agency, is entitled to what we call maintenance, which means in the course of a program, say a level 2 diploma, an ESOL program, or an access to HE program, or an independent living program, to what we call maintenance, which is the day-to-day issues that might come up to do with learning are covered by what we call your core funding. So, you know, I'm having a bit of difficulty with my A-level physics. Please can you help me just understand this concept? Or I've not understood the way that verbs work in English or whatever. That would be considered to be maintenance, and it's the part and parcel of the normal support that tutors provide, part of the normal pastoral care that's provided through your tutorial program. Additional learning support is direct support for learning that's over and above that which is normally provided in the standard learner program that leads to whatever that learning goal is, whether it be A levels, GCSEs, ESOL, towards independence or whatever. So it's, first of all, it's that additional, that activity, which is over and above, but also it's only available to those learners on funded programs. So the first point about funding of learning support is the only people that get learning support are those who are eligible to be funded by the ESFA in the first place. And that raises issues, for example, about full cost programs, which are not publicly funded, and how do you provide the support there? The other thing to note is that this is very much about helping learners gain access to, progress towards, and successfully achieve their learning goals. So if sometimes we want a basic, very simple principle that determines what is additional learning support is, it's basically anything which overcomes barriers to learning and therefore barriers to even entering your organization. Secondly, it's about helping the learner to become more skilled through whatever program of study they have, whether it be basic skills, the skills that might be needed for progression to HE, whatever. And thirdly, it's about what you're doing to support the learner to be more effective in their contribution to the community, for example, towards employment, or to become healthier, or to be able to live an independent life. So I think those are very important principles. But of course, it also raises the key question. If we know it's additional, where does that need arise from? And it could be from a learning difficulty and or a disability. So that's got a broad range of special needs. There could be sensory impairments, there could be conditions in the autistic spectrum, there could be physical disabilities, there could be moderate to severe learning difficulties, there could be healthcare needs, for example, epilepsy, or there could be profound and multiple learning needs. So it's a wide variety of learning difficulties and or disabilities, but also support that might be required to allow that person to progress to learning, particularly higher learning or further learning, or employment, or to apprenticeships, or to independence, or to good health, but also includes those things which maybe are high incident, but sometimes quite low cost aspects of learning support, such as help with literacy, numeracy, or language support requirements, for example, for ESOL learners. So I think that broad range of needs, and again, those which are over and above that which is normally provided in terms of standard learning support, in terms of support you provide, the help that you provide, or the activity, is very important. So I think it's sometimes useful to go back to those first principles. So in other words, maintenance, the day-to-day difficulties that almost all learners face, are actually already covered by your core funding, whether it be for a young person or an adult. So where does that funding actually come from? Well, let's have a look at the three main things that we're going to cover today. For those of you predominantly working with 16 to 19-year-olds, the funding for learning support is basically, it comes through what we call a funding allocation. And you will have soon be receiving your funding allocations for the next year, 2021 to 22. I will refer mostly to this year's current allocations. That's the year 20 to 21. And that allocation will have come to your organization. It's in a public domain. You should know what it is, whatever your role is in learning support, whether you're a learning support tutor or you're the coordinator or manager, or if you have an associated role in learning support, such as say job coach or whatever. It's always important to realize if you've got 16, 17 and 18-year-olds in your organization, or any 19 to 24s who have got educational health care plans, that they're funded through this funding allocation that's already in your institution. And it's through a methodology that basically takes account of the number of learners you've got and the size of programs that they've got, as measured in the total number of hours that each learner does in a course of a funding year. Now, the core funding for your 16 and 17-year-olds, it's slightly less for your 18-year-olds, unless they're high needs learners, is £4,188. So that's basically what a learner is doing. An average size program of 600 hours is being funded at through the ESFA, and that would be in your funding allocation. Now, that's before we take account of the different types of programs that learners have got. That core funding would be basically for the majority of art, humanities-based A-levels and GCSEs. It would be more for science, it would be more for engineering, but that core funding is higher than it was in the previous year. And that obviously is one aspect of this, is that core funding reflects already an increase of 4.7% in the last year, but is that enough to cover the attendant cost that you've had certainly over the last 10 or so years? Where does the disadvantage funding come in? Well, the disadvantage funding, there's two types. One is based on postal codes and one is based on prior attainment in English and maths. And disadvantage funding is a key element of the funding for learning support for what we call high incidence, low cost learning support, which in many of your institutions will be the majority of your learning support learners. If you're a specialist provider, then it might only be a small number, because the chances are that you have a larger proportion of learners who are high needs learners. And their funding is when the learning support costs on top of the core funding exceeds more than £6,000. So you could have a high needs learner whose core funding is around £5,000. The high needs funding is the first 6,000 is part of your allocation. Anything above 6,000, as you know, is funded by the home local authority. That's sometimes known as top up or element 3. Now, I'm not going to spend too much time looking at the high needs funding methodology. I'll cover that in course 1. So the more learners you've got historically, because this is always done through what we called a lagged student number effect or learner number effect, is that last year's numbers determine next year's, this year's funding. This year's students determine next year's funding. Although there's been some in-year funding for any large increase in 16 to 18 numbers that you've had this year because of the COVID situation and the reduction in the number of opportunities for young apprentices. So that's what I'm going to cover first. For those of you predominantly working with adults aged 19 and over, and this basically is adults without education healthcare plans, there are two primary sources of funding for learning support. Is the adult education budget, which is set nationally for about half the country, and devolved for the other half of the country. So if you've got learners coming to you from in Greater London, Greater Manchester, Liverpool, West Midlands, Tees Valley, north of Tyne, next year it would include Sheffield City region, then that is coming to you through a devolved adult education budget rather than nationally. There are also learners who have taken out loans, what we call the advanced learner loans for programs at level 3 and above. They are also entitled. And remember, this is about recognizing not only what's in SEND, which covers obviously everyone up to the age of 25 if they've got education and healthcare plans, but also the Equality Act, which covers all learners. And obviously it's got important implications when we start looking at things like adaptations in the workplace, which of course is also covered. Here, the funding is £150 per month that you can claim for learning support for each individual. Remember, this is additional to their core program, for each adult per month that you're providing learning support. And that is recorded on the individualized learner record. That's the means by which you record any activity that an individual is eligible funding does, the core program, the learning support, their circumstances, their postal codes. And that is then the basis of your claim for funding from the ESFA, whether you're grant funded like a college, or a local provider or a local authority, or funded by contract if you're an independent learning provider. If the learner needs more than £150 in a month, any adult, that's either AEB or loan funded, then there's a way of claiming it called the excess learning support, which we'll look at. For learners on advanced learner loans, the funding comes through, again, at £150 per month, but through what we call the loans bursary fund. The last group that we'll spend a bit of time looking at are apprentices of all ages, whether they be young apprentices or adults. Once you are an apprentice, the funding is coming to you directly as a provider from the Education and Skills Funding Agency. Because normally on an apprenticeship, you negotiate the price for training and assessing an apprentice with the employer, but the cost of the training and assessment does not include learning support. That is something that comes to you through a claim that you make, through either an allocation, through payment on actuals, on the actual activity, which comes to you directly from the ESFA. And that again is claimed at £150 a month on the ILR. So you can see how important the standard amount is, because it basically is there to recognize what the average cost of learning support is for learners in those situations as adults or apprentices. If you need more than £150, and you have to have the evidence, by the way, in a month, then again, you claim what we call excess learning support. The other thing to note, although it's not just available for apprentices, although that's where a large component of it is, there's also funding from something called Access to Work, which is coming from the Department for Work and Pensions, which pays for adaptations or transport, for example, to learners on for example, on a supported internship or on a work placement or on an apprenticeship or at work. So we'll look at that as well. And it's not just available for apprentices. There are obviously people who are 16 to 19 and 19 to 24 with education healthcare plans that can also get access to work funding, particularly if they're on a supported internship. Now, there are other sources of funding, very specific projects, there's charities, etc. But these are the primary sources of public funding. Would you want to ask any questions before start looking at them in a bit more detail? Is this, I'm just looking at any questions. Yeah, so everyone quite comfortable with that. Let's have a look at young people then. Because basically in England, whatever type of institution you are, whatever type of organization you are, the main driver of how much you get allocated as funding for young people, 16, 17 and 18, and that includes 19 up to 24, although sometimes they're 25 when they finish the programs with education and healthcare plans, is that the main driver is the number of learners you've got. So the more learners you've got, then the more funding you get next year. That's what we call the lag number effect. How much you get for each learner depends on the size of their what you call funding band. The more hours they do, the bigger the funding band. So for young people, the funding is attached to the whole of their activity, known as the study program, not to individual component parts, which is the way we fund adults, for example. We do reduce a bit of your funding for non-retention. So if a learner's not retained on their big program, their A level, their level 2 diploma, you will lose 50% of the funding next year. But of course, it's always a lagged effect. So anyone who's not retained, and don't forget, non-retention is any learner who's got to day 42, who's been with you for 6 weeks, who then isn't retained until the end of their core program, which could be their A level, their GCSE, their ESOL, their independent program, their level 2 diploma, their level 3 diploma, or their T level, then you will lose half of that funding, and that will be done through the lagged number effect. Program weightings reflect the fact that engineering construction increase the average cost of that number of hours that learner's doing. We then get a bit of funding for those learners that are on a level 3 program who haven't yet got English and maths grades, GCSE grades 4 to 9. Disadvantaged funding is the first one that identifies itself as something to do with additional learning support. And I'll pick that up in a minute. The large program effect is just basically if you've got learners doing 4 or more A levels equivalent, there's a bit of additional funding. But your core program funding reflects the size, the number of learners and the size of programs that are doing. And the only thing that reduces your funding is if you don't retain the learners. So one of the questions I want you to think all the way through, if your organization is investing in learning support for young people and for adults, what's it getting as a return in, for example, attracting more learners in the first place? So there's your access to learning and increasing participation. And secondly, how's it improving the quality of their experience? the quality of teaching and learning, and therefore are you retaining more learners? And I always say, whenever you make a business case for learning support, particularly if you're new to learning support in your organization as a manager, and you want to make a case for more resources, use that argument about without learning support, without investing in learning support, we wouldn't have had the numbers in the first place, and we wouldn't have such a high retention rate, as well as obviously improving achievement and progression rates. But you'll notice that in the 16 to 19 funding formula, there's no achievement element. That's more to do with quality and Ofsted. You lose funding if any learners are not doing English and maths that should be. You then get some additional payments for level 3 maths, what we call the advanced maths premium payment. If you're doing high value courses, such as engineering and construction, there's a bonus now of £400 per learner. But also to forget that there's now, if you're doing T levels are funded using a band, higher band of funding, which is reflecting more hours, but also there's funding for the placements. And then you've got other aspects of funding to do with high needs learners in particular, which I'll pick up, which means that, for example, high needs learners appear inside your allocation. And that's the second place that you'll see a specific mention of learning support. And again, high needs learners are already included in your student numbers up here. So if I've got 1,000 students, of whom 80 are high needs, the 80 are already there because they're funded at a basic rate of funding, depending on the size of their program and what kind of program they're doing, program cost weighting. But also, the first £6,000 of their learning support, what we call element 2, is also in your allocation. So if there's 80 at £6,000, that part of the organisation's allocation would be £480,000. And then you've got the student support funding, part of which is bursary for vulnerable groups, and then the discretionary support as well. But that's to do with learner support. So you can always watch, when you look at your allocation, the first question I'm really going to say is, this is an allocation. This is how an allocation to an organization which is eligible to be funded by the ESFA for young people gets its allocation. If you haven't seen your allocation for your organization, that is one of the action points from this morning. Go and find out. Ask your MI manager, your finance team. It's also in the public record. Every single organization's allocation for 16 to 19 funding is on the ESFA's website. You can have a look at it. And then pick up the bits about disadvantaged funding, pick up the bit about high need student funding. And you might also want to pick up anything else that might relate to how well those learners are supported in terms of things like student support funding, which covers things like travel, free meals, books, as well as the bursary for students in vulnerable groups, including those, of course, who are in or left care. So you can see how that allocation comes into the organization. But here's a key question and a key issue is your organization, if it knows how much it's getting through disadvantaged funding, knows how much it's getting through high needs funding, it's still got the discretion. These are not what we call ring-fenced amounts. Your organization can invest in learning support, additional learning support from its total funding allocation. So it could be looking here at whatever it's getting there. It might say, well, we'll put a bit of that into learning support because we think that's important. It can use, some of that funding there in the, to say, well, if we know what engineers and construction learners are more likely to have these, we can use some of that to support them as well. It's very much about how your organization prioritizes those three things that I mentioned: overcoming barriers to learning, helping learners to become more skilled, and helping learners to contribute in whatever their individual roles are to the wider community. And that includes employment as well as living independently. So that's a very important thing to stress when you start looking at the funding for young people. So as we said, the learning support then, if we start looking at it, then any learners who are 16 to 18, any learners who are without an education healthcare plan, 16 to 24, but whose learning support costs come to less than 6,000, they're funded through that thing known as disadvantaged funding, which you saw in the allocation model I just showed you. So that's very important because that's where you're going to identify it. Again, I think if you're feeling comfortable with that, then you'll realize that those learners who are 16 to 18 and those with education healthcare plans who are 19 up to 24. Remember, it's the age of 24 on the 31st of August in the year in which they're actually doing their program. Then if their costs come to more than £6,000, they're classed as high needs learners. So you can see that that £6,000 is an important threshold between what is funding through disadvantage funding and what is funded through high needs funding. If you've got any learners, by the way, who are part-time, and for example, we do, because we have beauty therapy students that will start with us around Easter, who'll go on till next this March. Well, they're part-time this year, part-time next year. But when you add the two halves together, they come to more than 540 hours, which is what determines whether they're going to be a full-time learner. Then they are also high needs learners, even though they've been doing part this year and part next year. We have quite a lot of learners who are split their learning year across 2 academic years, and that's something to take note of. So this first block is known as disadvantage funding. By the way, it's very important because look what it says. Disadvantage funding recognises that some learners, that's 16, 17 and 18-year-olds, and 19 to 24s with educational care plans, require additional support, A, to participate, there's the barriers, removing the barriers to learning, and to achieve, there's a skilling, and if full participation and improved attainment are to be achieved. So they're investments. And there's 2 blocks, Block 1, economic deprivation, and Block 2, prior attainment. Block 1, which currently is based on Index of Multiple Deprivation 2015, it means that the 27% poorest, the 27% of postal codes which indicate the highest levels of deprivation earn some kind of disadvantage funding, Block 1. By the way, for next year's allocations, the index is going to be updated to the 2019 one, which could mean that some wards gain and some lose. Just watch out for that. Block 1 also supports those in care or who have recently left care, which is, by the way, £480 a year per learner, regardless of their programme size, because quite a lot of the other, for example, Block 2, does take account of the size of their programme. Anything above 540 hours considered to be full-time, less than that a year is part-time. So what is this Block 2? Block 2 is the one that's very important for learning support. Basically, it's low-cost learning support, which we used to call any learning support that was less than £6,000. But it uses a proxy, and the proxy is what was the learner's prior attainment at the end of year 11, Key Stage 4, in GCSE English and Maths. Right? So it doesn't take account of what you used to spend on low-cost learning support. It doesn't do that. It says, and it's not intended to fund English and Maths because they're already part of the core funding. So you include English and Maths in what makes up the 540 or on average 600 hours to deliver either the functional skills in Maths or the GCSEs. What it's there is to fund support for all those learners, including those that don't have GCSE English for grades 4 to 9. So it's low cost, high incidence, learning difficulties and disabilities. So basically it's everything that costs between £1 and £5,999. So essentially you've got, in effect, and for example, I'm the governor of a medium-sized college, we will have hundreds of learners in that 16 to 19 age group who are being funded for their learning support out of our Block 2 funding, plus anything else that we can add to it. However, and this is something you've got to be aware of, Block 2 funding, which takes account of prior English and attainment in English and Maths GCSE, is not ring-fenced. It's up to your organisation, your college, your local authority, your school, to determine how it wants to use it. But the impact on participation, retention, progression, they should be measurable. So that, for example, when Ofsted asks, well, what was your investment in Block 2? How have you used it? And what's been the impact in terms of delivering those important aspects, and particularly with respect to what you've said in your code of conduct and in your mission about SEND. So you can start to see that there are some. So it's paid to you. And by the way, if you're grant funded, like a college or a school, you get this basically this allocation profiled over the course of a year. So over 12 months, it comes to you and it's paid on profile. If you're funded by a contract, it's paid on actual. So what you've got, if you're a learning support, part of the learning support team, whatever role you've got, whether it be direct delivery, coaching, or in some way helping to manage it, you've got to understand how much it is. And then if you're not feeling that you're getting your fair share of it, how to make a business case. And my argument for business case is always, how would we improve participation, the number of learners? How would we improve retention? And, you know, if you can retain a learner who is bringing in £5,000, remember what the cost is of them not being retained after they've become a start, which means after they've gone to the ILR. If anyone gets to day 42, they become a start. After that, if they leave early without completing the program, the 5,000 becomes 2,500, and that's then factored into next year's funding rate for you. So you can understand that if you can save 4 learners, that's 4 2,500. It's £10,000. That might be worth that investment in learning support. So what are the rates? Well, block 1, based on postal codes, the 27% of poorest postal codes, the lowest disadvantage uplift is 8.4%, and the highest is just over a third. So in some boroughs, some wards, in Blackpool, on the south coast, in London, in Leeds, in Sheffield, they will be getting close to 30%. So that increases the funding available for a learner to take account of what we call economic deprivation. For those which is you're interested in, which is block 2, the rate is a flat rate of £480 per subject for full-time learners, and then it's reduced for part-time learners. And by the way, this also means that you can have T-level learners who are also going to draw down £480 because they might not have English and maths. But since they're T-level, and the assumption is the program is therefore longer, they actually get £650 per subject. So if, and by the way, these are the way the calculation, remember it's historical, so it's always based on previous year's completed data. It is important therefore to understand that when you look at block 2 funding, if I look at, for example, one of my, I'm also director of a training company, right? In our training company, we have about 100 learners that haven't got GCSE English, and we've got about 100 learners that haven't got GCSE Maths at grades 4 to 9. That's 200 incidents. Each one of those, if they're full-time, and they all are full-time, will draw down £480, but it's lagged. It's not this year's learners, it's last year's learners. So obviously, the more learners you have this year without English and maths, the more you'll get next year. The less learners you've got this year, less incidents you've got of learners not having English and maths. And some learners, of course, will be 2 incidents. They won't have English and they won't have maths. Right? So you might have that as quite a common outcome, particularly on your entry and level 1 programs. Well, each one of those generates £480 that comes into the organization. Remember, it's historical. It's not based on this year's numbers. It's based on a previous year's numbers. Thank you for that. That's just to clarify. One of you asked me, is that this year's learners? No, it's a previous year's data because it all is based on ILR data for complete years. Now, clearly, you can start to see that if the performance in Key Stage 4 improves, there'll be fewer incidents of this, and therefore, there'll be less, if you want, low-cost learning support funding. But I want to just stress something. It is not, this funding isn't solely to support those learners with low levels of literacy and numeracy. It's for a whole range of learning support needs up to those people who would be, you know, coming in at less than £6,000 in their additional learning support costs. So I just wanted to clarify that. Thanks for that question. Yeah, if that's right. So you, thank you, Lizzie. If you've got any learner who counts twice, each incident is 1 at 480. So if they don't have English and they don't have maths, that's £960. And that's on top of their core program, you know, the 4,188. So that gives you an important indicator of how much is available. So as I said, find out how much is coming into your organization. The other question, I think one of you has asked me, do high needs learners? Yes, a high needs learner, if they don't have English and maths at grade 4 to 9, are also featuring historically in the disadvantaged block 2. So something just to bear in mind of. No, they're not excluded from this. Yeah, if you have a T-level learner, potentially, although I would think it's very rare, I would think most T-level learners would have at least one of them at GCSE grade 4 to 9, then yes, it would be potentially to £650. Okay, thanks for the questions. That's good. Now, I want to just mention something very specific about 16 to 18 that perhaps we don't always cover. Can I just ask, how many of you are currently offering 16, 17, 18, 19 to 24-year-old students with education and healthcare plans supported internships? Can we just have a show of hands? Just use your show of hands there. Raise your hands. Well, that's the biggest number we've had, I think, so far. That's just under half of you. That's great. Put your hands down. That's wonderful. That's actually quite interesting because that's the single biggest number as a proportion of people listening in. They're very specific because I think when we look at supported internships, they are funded through study programs, basically 16 to 19 allocation method and funding formula. But it does include a lot of learners who are up to 24. That means that's their age on the 31st of August, the year in which they're doing the program. And they've got to have an education and healthcare plan. But the primary driver here is wanting to move into employment, and they might need extra support to do so. It's normally a one-year program. The work placement's got to be at least 6 months. By the way, it doesn't have to be with one employer. It can be with more than one employer if that suits the needs of the learner. It's funded through the formula. It includes high need funding. Almost all of our supported interns are high needs learning and learners, but also some of them are getting access to work funding from DWP to pay for job coaches or any adjustments that are made in the workforce, in the workplace, which the employer couldn't have reasonably paid for, can be claimed through the DWP through access to work. So I think there's a very specific type of study program. Notice, by the way, it's got to be at least 6 months. And what you'll notice also is when you look at these, the majority of time is spent on employers' premises. So what we're doing is complying with real job conditions, timekeeping, dress code, etc. Our approach, and I don't know if we still tend to use place and train, which is that by transferring what they've most likely done in terms of preparation for our supported interns, most of them have done a work placement or several work placements internally. Now, these count as the work preparation. They don't count as the external work placement, but they transfer the learning from these settings then to another setting. So they might work with Marks and Spencer's, or they might work with John Lewis Partnership, or with, a local authority in a care home, or working in, for example, catering in a school, whatever. But they can then transfer the learning into these different settings. And I think that's where you enhance the learning. It gives them developing independence, employability skills. Some of our learners go on to do the Duke of Edinburgh Award scheme and things like preparing and for employment, developing independence. A lot of the learning outcomes here are very much about personalized to the needs of the learners. And also we cover English, maths, and digital skills at the appropriate level for those learners. So this is very much a sort of study program with the essential parts of it in terms of the work experience and work placement, but recognizing this is very much about the development of the individual that allows them to have a personalized curriculum which prepares them for adulthood or independence or employability or social skills, good health. All of these are different aspects of it. A lot of the learning, if they're not leading to regulated qualifications, then a lot of the learning is using RARPA, which I know you're all familiar with, which recognizes and records progress and achievement. So it measures their progress, particularly when non-regulated quals have been used. So in things like employability skills, etc. But it's got to be the right type of job for them and the right type of job for the employer. And then we have round that all of the support you'd expect, job coaches and tutors. And if those job coaches are usually funded through access to work, if not, they're coming out of the high needs funding. One little issue, by the way, with internships is make sure you're not claiming two sources of funding for the same activity. Using high needs to pay for some element of the the coaching, and at the same time claiming for the same hours of coaching DWP funding through access to work, just to avoid that. And then there's the specialist support if there's health issues, access issues, etc. For example, we currently using access to work because some of our learners, to be able to access their original workplace is not possible. They now have to go further because of social distancing and COVID, and to do that, that means they've got to have someone's go in time to do it. So there's, that we're claiming for that through access to work, or should I say the learner is claiming, and then we'll show you how the system works later on. So here's an example of a supported internship learner. Core funding for their program. Their program is 720 hours. So remember, the 540 hours sets off the maximum funding. So that's about 5,000. Element 2, the first 6,000 comes to us through our allocation, through the high needs funding, which you'll be familiar with. The home authority of that intern, is 5,500. That's the top-up funding they pay for. And by the way, without an agreement that this is a high needs learner with the home local authority, remember, they're not a high needs learner. So that's something just to note for purposes of your claim. And therefore, you can see that that learners program for a one-year program is £16,500. So that's the way the different bits come together to create that 720-hour program for the learner and to be able to fund the, for example, the job coaching, etc. Now, a lot of these learners, by the way, that's just the funding from the ESFA. Some of these learners will also be getting access to work funding. So any questions about supported internships? Any of you thinking about who are currently not offering supported internships have been thinking about doing it, either doing it, as individual organizations, or why not come together with other organizations and put on a really good supported internship, program as part of the COVID skills recovery in your area? That would be really, because there will be opportunities in certain sectors, such as the care sector, logistics, etc. So any of you thinking about doing it? Just a show of hands. If anyone's thinking about doing it, then obviously keep in touch with us or with Claire at NatSpec. Yeah, we've got a few. Thank you. If the program costs more than £16,500, well, remember, your estimates of costs have gone into determining this, because your top up, the element 2 and 3, when you work out the high needs learners, you're either using a cost form or you're using a matrix. That is part of the discussion that comes out of, not your discussion with the ESFA, because ESFA pays you the first £6,000. It's always the bit about the top up. And of course, we know what the discussions you've had with different local authorities about how to cost the activity. So I will mention a little bit near the end about the costing of the activity. If the funding is 16,500 and it's costing you 17,000, then I think you're bearing a bit of yourself. But obviously it's the other, because sometimes you might claim 16,500 but only spend 16. It's supposed to even itself out. But it's a good question you've posed. I think the difficult element is always element 3. And of course, if the local authority does not agree that the person's high needs, you wouldn't even get the first 6,000 from the ESFA. And remember that is based on places rather than individually named students. Yes, you can. Yes, if you can. Sue, there's a question there. Can we charge the LA? Yeah, as long as you have proper cost base for determining how much the cost is. But you'll always have a discussion with, and I daren't raise the issue about how different local authorities behave when it comes to negotiating top-up funding. But we work very successfully in our area with several local authorities, and we've had less issues with them. But I do know that there are other ones where they're either strapped for money, particularly at post-16, and therefore they've prioritized early years, primary and secondary, and it's more difficult. I understand. Okay, so here are the questions that I will come back to at the end of the day. So don't bother too much about them. Just have a look at them, because these are things which immediately arise out of what we've covered today. And if you're not sure about what the small group size factor is, I will give you a little bit of an explanation, but I know some of you will be using it. Small group size factor means that for some discrete groups, you will have a smaller average group size compared to what you normally would have in your institution. So in ours, it would be 16 would be the average group size for level 2 and 3 programs. We have a discrete group that we might only have 8 in, That's not because we've only recruited 8. This is because we deliberately design it around the 8 because of their individual needs. Some of them could be high needs. And what we then use is we say, well, if the cost of a lecturer is £50 an hour to put in the class, that's not what they get paid, that's what it costs. Then an average group size of 16 would be our benchmark. That's about £3.33. If we have 8 in the group, that's £6.66. That means that the difference between the two in terms of the small group size factor is £3.33. How many hours are we doing the program for? 600 hours. 600 at £3.33 is £2,000. That £2,000 goes into the calculation of how much learning support that learner needs. And obviously, if that then tips the learner over £6,000, it makes them a high needs learner. So that's what we mean by the small group size factor. Now, remember, and this is just a point from a previous group, that if you were intending to recruit 16 to that class and you only got 8, then you can't use learning support to make that viable. The 8 have all got individual needs. I'd expect to see an additional learning support form, either using, or you could do it electronically for each one of those with a clear plan that says the reason they're in the small groups is because they, in a discrete group, is because they are, for example, working towards independence or whatever. So that's something that I think the most frustrating thing will be what happens when your learner is costing about £4,500 a year in terms of learning support. They're not high needs. So you're covering the 4,500 out of what's basically in block 2 disadvantaged funding. So it doesn't take long for several 4,500 to make it difficult to support maybe those that are only costing you £600 or £700. So you can see some issues there. But I'll come back to that. But it's just interesting talking to a provider on I think the first session. They had 2,000 incidents of full-time learners not having achieved grades 4 to 9 in English and maths. They didn't realise that that was £960,000 that's coming into their allocation. And so I said, well, have you worked out at how many hours of classroom support that could purchase at, say, at £20 an hour? 48,000 hours of support. That's basically 24 full-time LSAs. Quite interesting. Okay, so we'll come back to these questions later. Now, for adults, the funding here is not attached to the individual, if you want the totality of the program. It's attached basically to each individual learning aim they do. And we know that some adults, to be able to access learning, such as an access to HE course, ESOL, a level 2 diploma, GCS English and Maths, will need that learning support to either start or stay in learning. So we're always got with this access skills development. If we've identified they've got a learning difficulty and or disability or a financial barrier, that's learner support, not learning support, then the allocation that your organization gets allows you to claim learning support and our learner support, that's where there's financial hardship, to meet the additional needs of learners. So the adult education budget, which is an allocation that comes to you from the ESFA if you're in a local authority that's not covered by devolution, different from those of you in a devolved, where it's coming to either from Greater London, Greater Manchester, in future Sheffield City region. But it's the same methodology. Basically, it says that they will fund learning for any individuals who are age 19 and over, and including under 25, who are not subject to an educational care plan, or anyone aged 25 and over. So the large number of adults who are not covered by educational care plans will be funded by the adult education budget, as long as you've got an allocation. Clearly, if you haven't got an allocation, you won't be delivering programs for them. So this is basically all non-apprenticeship adults, other than those doing loan-funded provision. So if you've got an adult education budget allocation, say £1 million, inside that £1 million, there will not be a figure that says additional learning support. It is, again, it's a single line budget. You've got to identify how much you need to use to support those learners with additional needs. And then you can claim £150 out of your allocation. This is not on top of your allocation. It's inside your allocation. It's inside my £1 million or my £600,000 or my 3 million if I've been, I've got such a large adult education budget. And that makes no difference whether it's coming to you directly from ESFA or through a devolved authority, but it's always identified on the ILR against one of the learner's learning aims. So if they've got 2, we'll attach it to 1. Now, what happens if £150 is not enough? Now, this is the way if you go back in history, the historical view was that on average, we knew that adults needed about £150 per month to support them. So therefore, we just simply gave that to everyone. It was based on historical data. Now, if you need more than £150, you can claim it through what we call excess learning support, but you've got to have evidence for that month. So if you've got, for example, in the first month of activity, a large amount of cost spent in terms of transition, in assessments, in getting the person inducted and starting the program, then you'll find that you're having to put a lot of support assistance time into that individual learner. If it comes to more than £150, keep the evidence, then you can claim anything above 150 through what we call the excess learning support, through a thing called the earnings adjustment statement. So if you're not from the management information or finance background and you haven't heard about the earnings adjustment statement, go and ask them in your organization. Ask the MI team, do we use the earnings adjustment statement to claim excess learning support for adults, apprentices, people on loan funded provision if their costs are above £150? If your costs are not above £150, then you won't have used the earnings adjustment statement. But the key thing here is it is not a separate line. It's not like the line that you have for traineeships or discretionary learner support, which might be a separate line. This is part of your allocation. So you've got to find your allocation first and then say, well, are we getting our fair share out of it? So the earnings adjustment statement is used by adults funded through the adult education budget for anything that's not reported on the ILR, or if you've got a learner where you put in the learner support for them, the learning support, but the program lasts only 2 weeks or 3 weeks, so it's less than 1 calendar month, then you can't claim it through the ILR because the ILR says your start date and end date has to be more than a calendar month, at least a calendar month. Then you have to make the claim through the earnings adjustment statement. If you've got any, and this, by the way, would work not just with classroom-based adult learners on the A-B, it would also apply to anyone funded through loans and the loans bursary, and also applies to all apprentices. If you're a grant-funded provider like a college or a local authority, then you'll be paid your money on profile, but you'd have to submit at least every quarter whatever your earnings adjustment statement is going to be. And certainly at the end of the year, it's reconciled to what you've already claimed. If you're funded through a contract, such as an independent training provider, then you'll be expected to submit your earnings adjustment statement every month, and then it's paid with next month's activities. So here's an adult funded, they could be on a GCSE, they could be on an ESOL program, and they're funded by the adult education budget, which is the allocation that's coming to you either from the ESFA for all the adults who are not unfunded, not apprentices, or coming to you from your devolved authority. It's the same methodology, by the way. We know that this person is with us for 7 months. We're going to claim £150 every month because the learning support is being delivered as part of their program on a regular basis. But we expended more in the first 2 months, and more at the end when we're getting close to assessing the learner. We put in some more support. We've got evidence through invoices, timesheets, etc., that person would have been getting one-to-one support preparing their portfolio or whatever, or they might have had an amanuensis or extra time to complete their assessments. Those costs are in that second row, and that comes to £1,450. We know roughly what it was each of those. You can either claim it, as I said, every quarter, or claim it at the end, but we know the difference is £400. So that £400 comes to us through the earnings adjustment statement. The 1,050 comes from the ILR. And I think that's very important to note. Built into this is the assumption that if, for example, in any 1 month, you spent less than £150, say in month 3 only 100, month 4 100, then this would be coming off any excess that you've already claimed. That's a very important assumption, something just to be aware of. That's built into this model. So that's the earnings adjustment statement. The other thing to note, by the way, there are some adults who might actually exceed even excess learning support to the tune of possibly more than £19,000 a year. I've only ever experienced 2 or 3 of these in my life. going across a whole lot of different providers. I'm sure you might have as well. This is what we call exceptional learning support, and that would be claimed directly, not through your allocation, but from the ESFA. And by the way, if they're 19 to 24, they should really have an education healthcare plan, and that means it would be funded through the 16 to 19 funding formula, not adult education budget. But if they don't, please have a confirmation letter from their local authority that explains why that local authority has not given them an education healthcare plan. And as I said, all of this is partly devolved to combined authorities or and delegated to Greater London, slightly different arrangement, or it comes to you directly from the ESFA. So for example, in our case, in my college, most of it's coming to us from the ESFA, but since we've got learners in Manchester, Greater Manchester, they're funded, their learning support is funded by Greater Manchester Combined Authority. Any questions about adults funded through the AEB and that £150? Yeah, if there's a question here about can the learner disclose? Yes, a lot of adults will disclose they've got learning support needs. What your job is to do is to assess it, produce the plan, which is how we're going to support that learner, cost the plan, and then that's the basis for your claim. The other question that I've got, I'm just listening, thank you. I'm just reading it. Yeah, if you've got an adult who you don't identify they've got a learning support need until, say, halfway through the program. When, for example, you might be doing a lot more written assessments and you decide to put a program support in, you can claim from that point. Yeah, so it doesn't have to be done at the beginning. As long as you've got the evidence, it's £150 a month. Yeah. Any more? Thank you for that. Now, it's the same principles, by the way, apply to loan-funded adults. Anyone who's funded through a loan, so these are adults age 19 and over who are not funded by the AB. They're usually on level 3 and above programs. It doesn't apply to anyone on programs less than level 3 for loans. Then what they can do, they can get help in terms of in-learning support. So you would use that for things like teaching assistance, reasonable adjustments, the things we've been talking about. And that again is claimed at £150 per month if you're a grant funded, like a college or a local authority. But if you're funded by contract, independent training provider, whatever, you would have to choose which one of the rates you want to apply. It's either A, B, or C, because it's a mix here of learner support, travel, meals, childcare, and learning support. If it's only learning support that you want to claim in a month, it's £150. So that is, again, the same sort of figure that you can use for adult education budget funded learners and loan funded. If you need more than £150 in any one month and you've got the evidence in terms of costs, then you can claim through the learning, through excess learning support. In other words, the earnings adjustment statement, something I've already mentioned. But there is one thing, and it's interesting that loan funded adults, they've had to pull this out and make it explicit. Learning support must not be used to deal with everyday difficulties that are not directly associated with the learner's learning on their program. So carrying out this assessment, recording the outcome of the assessment in a learner file. This is where the evidence base is so critical, particularly because although there's less audit of your 16 to 19, there could be quite a lot of audit activity around your adult or apprenticeship provision. And that's why it's important that everything is recorded on the learner file, which used to be called the learning agreement, and you keep all the evidence of assessment of needs, planned and actual delivery. By the way, your plan, your learning support plan for individual has got to be reconciled with the actual, it's because in some cases you anticipate these costs, you plan them, and then the learner stops attending or doesn't have the same needs, or you've got to increase the costs because more and more it becomes aware that the original plan wasn't going to be good enough to meet their needs. So it's just something to note about adults funded through the AB or for loan funded adults. Now, the last group are apprentices. And again, built into this is the expectation. Any learner publicly funded through ESFA, and that includes apprentices because although the employers pay a levy if they're large employers, or they pay 5% towards the cost if they're levy paying employers. Their learning support is publicly funded. And of course, that is just as important for those apprentices who declare or disclose are those that have had no formal and have had no formal diagnosis. The assumption is that you will identify and assess whatever those individual needs are. They're using either, BKSB for literacy and numeracy, Cognosys, whatever system you're using to identify individual needs, or call in specialists as well. Again, it's not to be used for everyday difficulties that are not directly associated with the apprenticeship learning. So again, they might need support in terms of adaptations or coaching, and that would be coming to you as well from Access to Work. So here are the requirements. Again, just the main principles: carry out thorough assessment, make sure that everyone's part and parcel of this, including the employer, of course. Deliver the support, record the outcomes in the evidence pack. Because there's a separate agreement. There's a commitment statement from the employer. There's also a contract that you've got with the employer and the individual, and to make sure that you report on the ILR what individual needs you've been meeting and how much you've been meeting, either at £150 per month or through the earnings adjustment statement, again, if it's more than £150. So here, the ESFA pays you, the provider for an apprentice, the £150 a month. Excess learning support claimed if you have got evidence of more than £150 through the earnings adjustment statement. And the same principles also apply if the learner's only getting support for less than 1 month. So if it's only for a couple of weeks, you can't use the ILR, you've got to use the earnings adjustment statement, the EAS. By the way, a lot of your learners, 16 to 18 and 19 to 20, already are getting incentive payments to take them on. This is before the COVID incentive payments. So if you were taking on young people, 16 to 18, 19 to 24-year-olds with education healthcare plans, or people in care, then the employer gets £1,000 for taking them on, and you get £1,000 as well. So those incentive payments are there in addition to any learning support. Of course, now there's also the £2,000 and the £1,500 support, incentive support for any new learners that you're taking on, in addition to those that you already have as part of the COVID recovery. So there are quite a lot of payments. And don't forget, 16 to young learners and 19 to 24s who have got education healthcare plans working in small employers with less than 50 staff. Those employers pay nothing towards the cost of either their training, their assessment, or their learning support. So that's totally covered by the public purse. But what we found, there are, and I mean, I've had one apprentice, by the way, in my experience, who was actually exceptional learning support, a learner with epilepsy, and his learning support each year came to more than £19,000 on top of the cost of his apprenticeship. The other thing to note is that it's always fully funded, so the employer doesn't have to make any contribution to it. If you find that a learner has completed their apprenticeship training but not yet finished their functional skills, and they need additional support to complete the functional skills, you can claim learning support even though they might have completed the rest of their apprenticeship. So just a couple of things there. Here's an example of a 17-year-old apprentice on a 30-month level 2 apprenticeship. There's the ILR claim. That's what we're claiming each year. This is in addition to the cost of the training and assessment. This is separate. Here's the ILR claim. You can see straight away, we're only providing learning support. Why? Because these are the blocks when the learner comes into our training, into our college or into our training centre. And that's the only time we provide learning support, is when we actually have contact with them. The actual cost, and that raises some interesting issues, but it's the pattern here with block release. If it was day release, it'd be different. And the actual cost, again, you can see comes to £1,450. So the excess learning that we'd claim through the earnings adjustment statement would be £550. You see how it works, that earnings adjustment statement. Any questions then about how apprentices are funded? Does it raise any issues for you? Do you actually know your organisation? I just ask, how many of you in your organisation are responsible for learning support for all learners, young, adults and apprentices? Can you just show of hands? So every single learner that comes across the threshold of your organisation, who's got a learning support need, you see. 4. Now that's quite interesting, because what I'm then, if you have got adults or if you have got apprentices coming into your organization and you're not responsible, who is? And how do they relate to you to ensure that they get an adequate support, for example, when they come in to do their off-the-job training, for example, with you? Or if there's a mixed class where you've got young people in a class, maybe doing a level 2 diploma, along with some adults. There's just some interesting questions there about where the management responsibility lies for those apprentices. Now, before we go for a coffee break, just a few words about access to work. How many of you are using access to work? Can you just show of hands? Just use your raised hand. How many of you are using access to work? Good. Again, that's about a quarter of you. Thank you very much. The same. Yeah, thank you for that. Thank you, Kim. Now, this is very important, because this is very much relevant to the needs of those learners who are in internships, long job trials, we call it doing work placements, possibly under the Kickstart scheme. This could be quite interesting, or on apprenticeships, or actually in work. And so this is the type of thing, it comes from the Job Centre Plus through DWP. The individual makes the claim, obviously informed by you. The DWP then reviews the claim, pays the money, and then the employer claims against the grant whatever cost of adaptations, because usually it's a lot of significant adaptations to premises, special aids, support workers, job coaching, travel to work, and awareness raising. The maximum grant, by the way, is £60,700. That's quite a generous grant per year per individual. So again, you know, where you can, but one of the big problems we've got, and I'm sure you've got, those people, is it's extremely administratively difficult. It takes a lot to get everything sorted out. And I think that sometimes makes it difficult for both the applicant. There's a lot of employers who go, oh God, there's a lot of fuss, you know, I'm going to have to do this, and how am I going to get the money back? So I think we often see those issues arising. And then, of course, be careful about not claiming double funding for the same activity through high needs and access to work, particularly if you're in the 19 to 24 age group with education healthcare plans. Any other comments? How many of you have been using access to work for your supported internships out of the 5 that put up your hand? Supported internships, yeah, that's the majority of you. And can you, all of you have put your hands up. And how many of you are using it for apprentices? Can I just ask, of those 5, how many are using access to work for your apprentices? For apprentices? Oh, right. Fascinating. They're eligible. So maybe worth having a look at in terms of the apprentices in your organization. Susan asked a very good question. Has anyone got any advice on, if you go on to access to work on the actual website, there's a lot of advice on how to claim it, but that's from the point of view of the individual learner or their advocate or sponsor. So I think, yes, if you go on, Sue, go on to the access to work, website. I've not seen any specific training on it. Might be something that we could do maybe in future. So it's a good question. Thanks for that, Sue. Okay, I think there's a couple of things then just to sort of finish off this first session and give you a break. And the couple of things are to do with really apprentices. There's a lot of concern about the whole process of learning support and additional learning support is off-putting to a lot of providers and employers. There's a lot of misinformation around. And although quite a lot of employers and providers know about learning support in terms of, you know, claiming £150, they don't know about excess learning support. They're not sure about these additional payments. They've not come across access to work, which obviously is quite interesting. So I think what's important is that we've got some kind of means of informing ourselves and even I found in a couple of colleges where the apprenticeship team is totally different, even in a different part of the organization from, say, classroom based, is that they weren't aware of learning support in its broadest sense, as we've been covering today. And that's particularly important when you're starting to look at learning support needs, and then, you know, things like social support needs and mental health issues, which I think obviously the COVID-19 issue is starting to raise in transition, return to learning. What are the issues for all the learners that have got behind not just apprentices, but classroom based? So I think there's a lot of evidence that that providers are not being using learning support as well as they could have. Now, you might be a really good model of how it's best used, but I think there's a lot of things that providers and employers would welcome about learning support for apprenticeships. What's available? Who's eligible? What can it be used for? What evidence and supporting information is required? What adjustments can be made? For example, do you all know that any learner with SEND doesn't necessarily have to do a functional skill at level 1 and 2? The minimum requirement might be entry level 3 in English and maths. Did you know that? Do you know that British Sign Language is a acceptable substitute on some apprenticeships for English? So just things to be aware of that I think will give us a better picture of what is available to apprenticeship learners. So we're going to take a wee break at this point, just stop there. Are there any more questions on how learning support is funded for young people, adults through the adult education budget and loans, and all ages of apprentices? Any questions on this? You've had a fair bit of input. Thanks for the questions that you've posed so far. Okay, right, we'll take...
And we're live again. I'll mute my microphone. Welcome back all.
Thanks very much then, Marek. Hope everyone's had the chance to have a refreshment. And I think one of the things that we're trying to achieve through the training sessions is not to become sort of experts in how funding works for learning support. It's to say, I know enough to know where the resource comes from, and maybe how to make sure we get more of that resource, particularly if you've got an increased demand from your learners or increased needs and different needs as well. I think the key thing about learning support funding is that it was and has been an area that's not always been at the forefront when you start looking at the big funding issues. But nevertheless, with all the work done by Little, Maynard, the Ofsted review, you can see how important it is in terms of doing those three things, you know, in terms of removing barriers to learning, improving skills, knowledge and skills of all learners, and certainly making it possible for everyone to contribute in some way to, you know, the community in its broadest sense, not just in terms of employment, but the other things we've talked about. A couple of questions that have come up over the break. Thanks very much. One was about 16 to 19 bursary fund, which also covers those 19 up to 24s to aged 19 up to 24 with education health care plans. I think the important thing there is that when you're looking at, there's two types of learner support. Do not confuse learning support with learner support, which tends to take account of the backgrounds of the learners, incomes, etc. You know, much more to do with the how much might be needed in terms of support for those with from vulnerable groups. So, for example, those in care or left care, those who might be getting universal credit, etc., 18 and over, but also the discretionary bursary fund, which is travel, free meals, and books. That's an assumed part. The bit that I can't really tell you very much about is because that depends very much on your own local authority, is what kinds of additional things local authorities might provide. For example, subsidized transport, and again, that will often be based on parents' income, etc. So these are the other aspects of support which are covered by learner support as opposed to learning support. So hopefully that's answered that question. So this last bit up till past, I think, really is about getting us to think what are the implications and the different issues that will be associated with the use of these sources of funding. I mean, Sue's actually posed quite an important question about free school meals. If it's not, I mean, it isn't. Are there any plans? Well, given all the other issues we've had around the importance of feeding young people when they're not at school, who would otherwise have been entitled, or at college. I think there's a lot of issues about the top up to the 16 to 19 bursary. I've seen nothing. I know that some local authorities have certainly been topping up those funds, but that's not a universal practice. So if you look at the allocation, the guidance on allocations for 21-22, there is some recognition of the increased costs. And that's why, rather than use historical data, because if you use the last full ILR data, it won't reflect the exceptional circumstances that we experienced in 1920 and then 2021. Because remember, it's covering COVID, from the lockdown last March to now. It's covering in effect 2 years. Is that what are we going to do? Use as the baseline? So I think, Sue, it might be worth having a look. Is the total amount that's allocated. I don't think there's going to be much movement on the amount allowed per student, because that's always been up to you to say, well, if the standard rate is just £3 per £3.50 or whatever it is per meal, you can obviously allocate more if you wish. And that is, that's up to your discretion. It's about what you've got as availability of funds to do that. So I think on the amount allowed per student, I can't sort of give you very much. Yeah, well, I mean, it's I think it's a decision. And I mean, I'll give an example. Certainly, I've been to a general FE college where there's been more allocated because they're using funds from full cost activity. So they can enhance what they're offering individual learners above that basic. So I think it's something that we need to have a bigger discussion on. You're quite right. There's different answers and there's different it looks like there's different rules. They're not different rules. I think it's just simply that people are applying them in different ways and using the discretion, particularly when they've got access to a wider range of funds, such as charities, bursaries, etc. But it's a good, maybe we should run a session on bursary funds, which I think would be useful. We haven't done that for a while. So a couple of things then, just to conclude. I think the message is, no matter what the source of funding is, you've got to make the most of it. You've got to use it in the way which you really do extract the maximum benefit from whatever limited funds you've got, because in some cases that's been the case. And I think that requires, therefore, commitment from governors and senior leaders. In your organization will be obviously a senior leader with responsibility for learning support across the whole organization. But do you know who your learning support governor is, or owner? If it's a board, if it's a private company or a trust, do you know who's on the trust is responsible for ensuring that the strategy for learning support is being delivered, particularly to comply with what you've got in SEND? Is it a well understood management structure? Does everyone know who's responsible for learning support in your organization? Is it for all? Is it just for classroom based? Is it for work based? If there's two separate, for work based is a different person from classroom based, does that understood by everyone? Does everyone understand where the responsibilities lie? Do you all have a good understanding of funding sources and audit requirements? As I said today, keep a record of all your costs. How do you record costs? What's your basis for costs? What do you include and what you don't include? By the way, if anyone wants to, I can send you a set of principles. It's a document which was used in one organization, but now I've made it more general, which basically saying this is what you can spend it on, this is what you can't, this is what you can't, and this is how you account for it. If you want that, then please just simply say at the very end, give me your email or send me an email, because I'll give you my email details and you can send me an email and I will send that document to you. Yeah, it's best if you just simply all email me, because yeah, great, thank you. But also, do all your staff know about what learning support is and how, if they have a learner who's got difficulties, have they actually gone and spoken to someone about identifying and recognizing that need, and know who to go to ensure that that person's individual needs have been met? So that's And do you train the staff regularly on aspects of SEND, mental health issues, and I've seen some very good programs being offered virtually to increase understanding. But do all your students and all your learners, do all your adults, your loan-funded learners, do your apprentices all know about learning support? And then do you meet with the specialist staff to ensure that there's an effective coordination? So I might be a generalist. I might be supporting apprentices. I am a workplace tutor. I'm supporting my apprentices. I'm identifying apprentices dyslexic. Who do I talk to? How do we coordinate the joint effort to ensure that that person is really, their needs are well met? And how do we ensure that we maximize the funding claim for that individual who might be with me for 2 years, might be with me for 3 years? Right. So there's a sense in which, again, I know some of you are saying, well, what system do you use? I mean, whatever system you use to record and prove the evidence and to monitor your ALS expenditure, make sure it's fit for purpose. So it might be a spreadsheet. We use eSpirals. I know that other people use EBS. Some of you will use ProMonitor. Some of you use, well, OneFile. Whatever system, as long as it does all of the things that you want it to do. We work effectively with specialist agencies, particularly at the moment, mental health agencies in our local area, as well as obviously the healthcare agencies, which are, looking after things to do with epilepsy, etc., other health care needs. And then use whatever system works best for the individual. Quite a lot of learning support is one-to-one, buddy system, adaptations to equipments. What is eligible is anything which makes the difference to the person over and above which we deal with everyday difficulties. So those where the expertise that you've got come in. And use the appropriate tools for assessing individuals and accrediting them. How many of you are using RARPA with your discrete supported learning groups? Yeah, how many of you are using RARPA? So it's not always about external qualifications. It's recognizing and recording the achievement using learning goals, progress sheets, whatever. That and they're absolutely a good way of recording that broad range of, particularly when you're wanting to facilitate progression, both internally and externally. And then there's the investment, because what comes out of the ALS funding is not just about what I'd call the day-to-day costs of learning support assistance, supported learning, small group size factor, use of certain tools and techniques, additional counselling support, smaller group size for tutorials as well as for the teaching of the subject. But how much have you invested in assistive technologies? For example, over COVID, and online learning? Have you invested in some of the tools which online really do work well for those learners that might struggle otherwise with remote and online learning? And then have you got an effective, learning support management system in place? Can I just check what sort of systems, just tell me, what kind of systems are you using to manage your learning support funding and learning support activity? What systems are you using? Just give us some idea. I've got a couple of coming up on the chat. Thank you. eSpirals, thank you. Pro Solution, yeah, good. EBS, thank you. Our own spreadsheet. Well, if you've only got, 20, 30, 40 learners, it might pay to just have your own system that records the expenditure, the plans, etc. But I think any system where you've got, when we're talking about well over £1 million spent on learning support, then we're certainly looking at using a system that gives us a whole lot of answers to a whole lot of questions. For example, do we measure the cost per learner, the claim per learner, and what outcomes are we getting for those learners in terms of improved retention, achievement, performance, closing the attainment gap, for example? All of this is a type of stuff that will not only be Yeah, the answers have been coming on the chat facility. So, and a couple of you only put them to me. But Pro Solution seems to be, and e-spirals. Thank you. Pro Solution and e-spirals. Okay, so that I think gives you a sort of an agenda for action in terms of saying, well, if I know what the sources of funding are, and I've now got an idea of how we can use the learning support funding, I think then that says, well, let's now take a very specific set of circumstances which have really tested this, and to find out from you how you've been able to offer learning support during COVID. And because we're just, we know we've got a date for coming out of lockdown 3. If you're in any of those categories, you will have got support. If you're a grant-funded college, school, local authority, for most of your 16 to 19 learners and your adult education budget learners, you've been okay. You've been given a little bit of security. The resources have been made available on certain conditions. It's been a bit more precarious for those of you who have operated on apprenticeships, because you've been relying on furloughing maybe your staff. We've had to furlough a lot of our apprenticeship staff because many of our learners, our apprentices, have been either furloughed themselves or they've been made redundant. We've relaxed a lot of the rules around apprenticeships, etc. But essentially, if you were getting any support from the ESFA, the assumption was that you'd have kept people on the current contracts, you've supported young people to the completion of their programs, even though it was a mixture of online blended learning, even though we're using a teacher assessment rather than external assessment. You always had to make sure that the face-to-face delivery was there for children of key workers and for vulnerable young people. And also, wherever you could, you would support learners, adults, but especially this would have been done through remote and distance learning, but also to make sure that all of those arrangements were in place that included online tutoring, webinars, e-learning, loan of IT equipment, etc. So there's a lot of expectations that all learners, irrespective of their age, would have got some kind of support if you were being supported, but also that it was highly likely that they would identify what you were doing to support eligible learners, including those with high needs. So it's not just high needs, it's any learners that have got additional learning support needs. Now, how is this being assessed? Well, to some extent, and we've picked up the issue about the free meals, by the way, separately. Ofsted was doing remote assessments of you. And I know some of you have already been through one of those, either a monitoring visit or a remote assessment, to say, well, if you're moving your learning online, how have you been supporting the whole range of learners, including those with learning support needs? And I think that has become an issue, but it's also an issue on the return to face-to-face learning. How are you going to prepare all of these learners that we've been talking about up to now and how they're funded out of this lockdown, and then towards not only in the transition, but towards the return to some kind of new norm, whatever that new norm is. So here's a question to you. What sort of things have you been doing that you think are particularly you're proud of, or you've had some kind of confirmation from Ofsted or a third party that what you're doing is good practice? So can we just have some, through the chat facility or through the Q&A, some responses from you about what you've been doing that you're particularly proud of, or you've had, for example, third party recognition, say from Ofsted or from parents or whatever, that's really good practice in support for learners, not just high needs learners, but all those learners that have additional support needs. So we got some in the chat facility. I'll read out. You've created new online work booklets for our interns. Thank you, Hanif. That's really good. That's and I think again that reflects that, you know, any group of learners, including supported internships, have had their own individual needs as well as more generic needs. I think more generically, all learners who have moved online have had issues with just, you know, coping with online learning, some more than others. Others have loved it. Some have now got tired of it, but I think there've been all kinds of ways in which we've been able to support. I mean, one of the things that we've been very proud of is that the amount of one-to-one tutor support has more than doubled for those learners. So they're now recognizing that not one contact, sometimes 2 contacts a week with the parents and themselves, they've really welcomed that sense of community. Working on teams and things like that, where you're still breaking into groups to do small group work, has been really useful. Support staff, thank you, Janet. Support staff have joined online lessons and then supported students in breakout rooms, what we've been talking about, or through one-to-one sessions after the main lesson. Also making weekly welfare calls. Can I just say that that's really been a good model, the idea of this welfare, well-being, phoning up regularly, contacting people, if not through phone, through emails, through all the sources. But also, we found what really works well is the buddy scheme, where learners have been, the more confident learners are buddied up with the less confident learners. Break rooms in a lesson for support to engage one-to-one plus weekly calls. Great, Kim. Good examples. Providing laptops. Where we've been able to, providing from our own resources or through the discretionary learner support funding, which you've been able to channel, iPads, laptops. But for us, the bigger issue has been the availability of the internet and Wi-Fi connection. So I think that's the other thing that comes with it. Great examples. Thank you. And I've shared some of those. New IT equipment. Thank you. So again, I think there's an expectation that your use of the learning support funds has also changed as those needs have changed over COVID-19. And after the first lockdown, these things were assumed. So remember, after the first lockdown, these were the expectations. The expectation now, after the third lockdown, the second one was much shorter, is that there will be some quite significant catch-up required. Now, you know about the tuition fund, which is being used. That will be obviously take account of this lockdown, and there will be an allocation of that. I don't know how it's going to be worked out, why it's going to be prioritised, but it was basically providing about £150 for each full-time learner. But it was targeting those without English and Maths GCSE at grade 4 to 9. But you didn't need to use it for English and Maths. You could use it for general issues, for well-being, for just catch up in a range of subjects. What about vocational students who have not missed out on practice time? So there will be some more coming your way. I think it was announced this morning. Thank you. So again, I think there will be expectations after this lockdown about what you're going to do in terms of helping those learners, particularly those that have fallen behind. But I think a more general issue is well-being and welfare of a broader range of students is certainly going to be. Sue, you've raised an interesting question. Sue's asked this question: can you use the tuition fund for well-being? I think if you can show, you don't have to target those learners who are just those without GCS English and Maths, but they will often be in groups, which a fair number of them haven't, is you can use it for tutorial support. Yes. So it isn't specifically just to catch up in English and Maths. You're just using that as that might be the target group, or at least part of the target group. But then what you might do is spend that energy, that £150 on putting in more tutorial support, more pastoral care. Yeah. It's really down to you, because you don't have to accept the funding. It's not mandatory to accept the funding. So it could be used for those purposes as well. And I think that's something to be aware of as we look into how the third lockdown is going to work. So I think those are some of the things that we've just asked about. How have you helped those learners who have fallen behind? So I think pastoral support, one-to-ones. I think we're looking to extending the day. We're not so sure about summer schools. I know that's been a popular thing in some areas, but much more for schools maybe than for colleges. But certainly by having additional classes on available to people will be part of the strategy, as well as maybe some evening provision, some after because many of our 16 to 19 will finish by about 5 o'clock. So there might be extra provision there. And at weekends for some of our vocational learners as well. So that's got implications as well. Okay. And by the way, this is interesting because when Ofsted visited us, this is some of the things that they came up with. You know, regular contact, welfare calls, enhanced focus on mental health, well-being. So all the things we've been talking about are good uses of learning support resources and funding at the moment. And, you know, I'm sure there'll be lots of good practice they'll find in your institution. So here are the contact details, Claire, if you want some more general questions about NatSpec and what it does. Myself, beachcatch@gmail.com, if you want copies. So just email me after today and I'll ensure you get copies. By the way, everyone that's attended today, after we've edited today and digitized it, Marek will make sure that NatSpec sends you a copy of the recording. So you can then go through it again, absolutely. And if there's any questions that come out from your revisiting the webinar, then get in touch with us. But I want to leave you with two things to take away and consider. Now, for those of you particularly working with young people, then the same set of questions are posed before. And if you don't know, find out. How is your organization's Block 2 funding, your disadvantaged funding allocated? Do you know how much it is? And how much is given to learning support? That's interesting. How much is used to support learners without English and maths at grades 4 to 9? For example, smaller class size, additional workshops. I mean in English and maths. So instead of, if you might have learners who are 16 to 19 and you've identified them as operating at entry level, then an English and maths class might be normally 16, while they might be in classes of 7 or 8. Or you might say that everyone gets 2 hours a week of English and maths, but if you've got these additional needs, we can put on additional workshops and you can attend them in addition to your class, you know, your 2-hour class. That would be a way of using disadvantaged block funding, but funding. But you can also use it for small group size factors that have nothing to do with English and maths, just the level of the learners, and particularly to support discrete groups. By the way, there's an explanation of how to calculate small group size factor in the principles paper. What other needs can be met out of this funding? Well, the issue is that, I described how those needs could be from sensory impairments to profound and moderate and multiple learning needs. It's very much about what you identify for the individual and the individual's best plan of action to be able to raise, to access the learning, to raise the level of skill and to allow them to progress, or to maintain a level of skill if it's about independence. I think we've got major issues about some of those costs being very close to 6,000, but not actually crossing the threshold, and therefore they're not high needs learners. For me, I would expect you, and no matter how small you are or what your role in learning support is, to know roughly how much you're spending on each learner. And do you know if that is producing any impact in terms of that person's attainment? And if it's closing the gap between those with individual needs and those who haven't individual additional support needs, then what's happening? Why isn't it? There's an issue about how the quality of the use of those funds, or some of the issues that you might face in terms of finding right staff. And I mean, for me, even if I've got the money, I might not be able to find the right staff. It's very much like the issues in the care sector. And how do you make a business case for a bigger share of the funding? Well, don't forget, if you retain a learner, you're basically getting 5,000. If they're not retained, you're losing 2,500. And on an adult, if you don't retain them, it's each month that they're not retained, you lose a proportion of the on-program funding. For adults, if the adult doesn't achieve the learning goal, you lose 20% of your funding. If an apprentice does not achieve their apprenticeship standard, you lose 20% of funding. Can I just say, on an advanced manufacturing apprentice, that's £5,400 you'd lose if they didn't achieve or didn't complete their endpoint assessment. So I suppose an argument I would have is, if I get the right amount of ALS budget in my organization, then I can deliver these improvements in retention achievement. And therefore, for every pound that we invest, we get this return, rather than just see it as a cost factor. That's a business case. And I know one of your colleagues said recently, well, all I've been doing up to now is whinging and it hasn't got me anywhere. No, let's have a business case. Let's have a set of facts that you can say, look, this is what we need. This is how we're going to use it. And this is what you're going to see as the improvements in retention achievement. And sometimes, don't forget, with young people and with adults, they will choose to come to you because of your reputation for the rounded support that you provide all your learners, including additional learning support. So it's also a reputational aspect. It's a value being brought to reality in actually spending the money and spending it well. For adults, this is a more difficult set of issues. Those of you who are working, can I just ask, by the way, from the participants, which of you are predominantly working with adults? Predominantly working with adults? Yeah, even if if you're predominantly working with adults who are 16 to 20, if you're working predominantly with adults who are 19 to 24 with education and healthcare plans, you're not covered by this. This is for adult education budget and loans. Then you can see that there are an additional set of factors. And the factors are usually because you've got an allocation that doesn't identify what learning support is, or your contract doesn't do it. Do you know how much you're actually spending? And is that the same as you've always spent over time as a proportion, or is it similar to other organizations? What I used to do was I used to encourage groups of providers to come together who are very similar and say, we'll just have a conversation when we had training sessions to say, how much what's your allocation? £1 million. How much do you spend on learning support for adults? Oh, £40,000. And someone would say, well, we spend £100,000, but we're roughly the same size. Why is that? Is it a different population, or a different set of priorities, or a different way of allocating budgets? And there's no benchmark, by the way, because I think it's useful. I used to think 7%, between 7 and 9% of my total allocation would be spent on learning support for adults, between 7 and 9%. But these are just because these are the figures that we collected over a period of time, and it gave us some kind of benchmark. How do we identify and assess the needs of adult learners? Is it a standard practice? If I'm on a 30-hour ESOL course, what's the chance of my individual needs being identified, assessed, and support being put in place if I'm only with you for 10 weeks? How do you inform learners? What kinds of support do you provide to adults? How do you deploy resources? Or is it mostly going for young people and what's left over for adults? How do you record all of your, are we using a standard form irrespective of the age of the learners? How do you monitor the learning support spend on adults? How do you know evaluate the effectiveness and impact? And then do you know what forms of support and which staff? I mean, because we use eSpirals, we can tell you now which of our learning support assistants spend most hours with individuals, which ones have had the highest impact in retention and achievement, and which ones have had the biggest impact in terms of progression, for example, because you identify everything through this system that tells you that can tie the individual support to an individual member's staff and vice versa to the source of that spend. So we know what is coming from different sources. So here's some questions for you to take away, and do so, please, because if you're the only person come from your team today, take these away and think about them. But also for any of you, and this is just, there are tools that assist with this. And here's an example. This is from one provider who has an adult learning support spend just about £600,000. So that gives you some idea of the scale. They break down their adults into age groups. They've got some 19 to 24, so are funded by the ESFA. You can tell there's 5 of them, 5 at £6,000. These are your high needs learners that are funded by, but they're in that age group. The adult education budget from the ESFA, the adult education budget from a mayoral combined authority, because some of the learners are coming to them from a combined authority and they're not funded by the ESFA, but they use the same methodology. The Loans Bursary Fund, LBF, and that's for any adults doing level 3 and above programs that need additional support. And then they've got the funding for their apprentices. This is their adult apprentices. Now, these are all the claims they make. If you look at the total claims, you can see how much they're claiming through the ILR and the earnings adjustment statement. I'm going to ask you a very simple question. What other information would be useful to tell us something about the use of funds in this organisation? So you know that they're drawing down about £600,000 worth of learning support for its adults. What other information would you expect to see that would tell you something about how effective the use of this was? It's a claim. This is what they're claiming from the funding sources, the funding agency. Any other things that you would expect to see or help you to understand what's going on in this organisation? All right, got a couple of answers. I'll just repeat the answers. Cost and number of students, good. Retention rates, Lizzie, that's good, because that would tell us for those different age groups and those different sources of funding where we're getting the best improvement in retention rates, and then we can compare them to the retention rates for those learners that didn't get learning support. Teresa, you said costs, student numbers. Yeah, because this is what we're claiming, £150 a month, remember, earnings adjustment statement, but is it the same as what we're spending? And that's where you've got to have accurate figures, because although this provider is claiming about 600,000, it's actually spending about 800,000. So it's not claiming as much as it's spending. There are other organizations which will claim 600,000, but might only spend 500,000. So they're overclaiming using, and that might raise questions about, well, wait a minute, why is your cost different from your claim? Well, I explain that with things like the earnings adjustment statement or not even using it. But yeah, good. Another thing that would be useful, anything else? Think about your data. That would be for 1 year. Yep, compare it to other years. Some costs might be hidden. Exactly. Not just as learning support. There could be a whole range of other costs. Do we know, for example, if they've covered all the administrative costs associated with managing learning support? Some of the costs are hidden because there are management roles in there. Absolutely. Thank you for that. Great answers. Great answers. So that's just an example of the type of thing I'd expect to see in a larger organization. This is obviously where your learning support funding for adults is well over 600,000. Many of you might be smaller than that, but it's the sort of thing that would say, yeah, I can start to ask questions and start to look at, is there a different pattern of age now compared to before? What's interesting, by the way, is the average age of those learners as they're getting older. There's just fewer of them, and I think that's quite fascinating, because in this organization, most of the adults are aged 19 to 29, so it's a younger looking place than maybe it might have done formerly. Okay, so those are some of the things that we hope that you will have benefited from. As I said, there's the contact details. Manik, are there any more questions? We can close the recording now. So thanks very much.